The day she made that call, everything changed. Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed. "Mom, I sold your house. You don't need it anymore." For a moment the world went silent. No wind, no waves, not even breath. Just that sentence, echoing through the phone like a door closing forever. She thought it was mercy, moving her mother closer, making life easier. But she didn't know what she'd really sold wasn't just a house. It was history. It was her father's hands in the wood, her mother's laughter in the kitchen. The kind of walls that remember love, even when people forget it. And what she didn't know was, that house never belonged to her to sell in the first place. If this story already hit something inside you, stay. Before we begin, make sure you're part of our little family here. Subscribe, like, and share if you believe every home has a heartbeat. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if someone sold the place that held your memories? Now let's begin. It was a quiet morning by the coast, the kind of morning where you can hear your own breath between the waves. Martha Hale had just finished watering the roses, her husband's roses. He planted them 20 years ago, said they'd outlive him. And they did. The smell of salt mixed with damp earth always reminded her of him, of coffee on the porch, of the way he used to hum off-key when sanding wood. The phone rang. She smiled at first, thinking maybe it was her daughter Grace calling to check in. But the voice on the other end wasn't soft or warm. It was brisk. "Mom, I sold the beach house. You don't need that space anymore. You'll stay with us for a while." Martha froze. The sound of the waves disappeared. Even the birds outside went silent. She could only hear her heartbeat, steady but heavy, like it was trying to understand what she just heard. "You sold it?" she asked quietly. Grace sighed, impatient. "It's better this way. You're alone there. We'll handle everything. Don't worry." And just like that, click, the line went dead. Martha stood there with the phone pressed to her ear long after the call ended. Her fingers trembled. She wasn't sure if it was anger, sadness, or disbelief crawling up her chest. Maybe all of it. She turned toward the open door. The ocean breeze brushed against her face, but it didn't feel like comfort anymore. It felt like someone had opened a wound she'd kept stitched for years. That house wasn't just a building. Robert built it himself. Every nail, every board, every window frame sanded by hand. He used to joke that the ocean would envy their view. He died 10 years ago, but his presence still filled every corner of that home. The smell of cedar in his workshop, the chair that still creaked where he used to sit, the picture of him on the wall, smiling with sawdust in his hair. Now her daughter had sold it like a forgotten trinket at a yard sale. She walked slowly into the living room. The floorboards groaned softly under her feet, like they were mourning too. The sun poured through the window, lighting up the photo of her and Robert on their wedding day. Dust floated in the air, dancing between them. She reached out, touched the glass. "You think you've taken my home," she whispered, "but you've only taken your roots." Her voice broke halfway through and she covered her mouth. The silence that followed was louder than any scream could have been. For a long moment she just stood there, staring at the framed picture, waiting for it to say something back. The longer she looked, the more it felt like he was slipping away again. She sat down on the old couch, the one they bought when Grace was still in high school. She could still hear her daughter's laughter echoing from years ago. The first time Grace learned to ride a bike, the way she'd run to the porch yelling, "Mom, Dad, look." Those echoes hurt now. They weren't memories anymore. They were reminders of distance. The kettle on the stove began to whistle, a sharp sound cutting through her thoughts. She turned it off, poured a cup of tea, and held it close like it could keep her from falling apart. The cup warmed her hands but not her heart. Outside the tide was rolling in. From the window she could see the line of foam crawling up the sand, closer and closer. For a second she thought of how many times Robert had stood right there, teaching Grace how to fish, telling her stories about patience, about how some things in life are worth waiting for. Maybe that's why she didn't call back. Maybe silence was the only language her daughter would understand. She walked back to the picture frame, adjusting it slightly, wiping away the thin layer of dust. "You'd laugh at me right now, wouldn't you?" she said softly to the man in the photo. "You always said I forgive too easily." The corners of her mouth twitched. Not a smile, just the shadow of one. When the sun shifted, the light hit the frame differently. For a second it looked like Robert's eyes were alive again, full of the same quiet strength she'd fallen in love with. That steadiness was still here, buried under grief and disappointment, but not gone. She put down her teacup, straightened her back, and looked around the room. The worn curtains, the wooden table, the empty chair. It wasn't just emptiness. It was history. It was love that had been built piece by piece and somehow still held together. Outside, the waves hit the shore harder now, like they were echoing her pulse. She took a deep breath and whispered into the still air. "That house wasn't just wood and paint. It was every promise we ever made. Then she closed her eyes, letting the sound of the sea wash through her again. This time it didn't sound like loss. It sounded like memory. If only Grace could hear what silence sounds like when it carries love instead of words. Maybe one day she will. And if you've ever had a parent who still keeps your childhood home standing, maybe tonight's the night to call them, just to say you remember. 3 days passed. The ocean had been louder lately. Or maybe Martha just noticed it more now that the house was quiet. She'd spent most of those mornings walking from room to room, cleaning, folding, touching things Robert once touched. It made her feel like time was still moving in circles instead of straight lines. That afternoon, while dusting the old photo of their wedding day, she noticed something strange. The frame wobbled slightly, heavier on one side. When she turned it over, the back was taped shut. Not the way she usually sealed it. Her fingers traced the edge, and under the tape, she found a yellowed envelope tucked behind the cardboard. Her heart skipped. Robert's handwriting. She'd recognize it anywhere. The letters were shaky, like they were written by someone who knew he didn't have much time left. On the front it said, "For Martha, open when you forget who you are." She sat down right there on the rug, the dust cloth falling from her hand. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Forget who she was? What did he mean by that? Her hands trembled as she tore the seal. Inside were several papers, a deed transfer, a small folded map of the local bank, and a note written on lined paper. The ink faded at the corners. The house, the land, the company, all under your name. Never let anyone take your peace. The words hit her like a slow wave. Not pain this time, something else. Relief. Maybe even protection from beyond. Robert had known her heart. Too gentle, too forgiving. He must have known someone would one day try to take advantage of that. She pressed the letter to her chest, eyes stinging. "Oh, Robert. You really never stopped taking care of me, did you?" For the first time in days, the silence in the house didn't feel cruel. It felt full. Like he was there, sitting in his old chair by the window, smiling that calm, knowing smile he always wore when she got worked up over something. After a while she stood up and looked around, not for answers, but for someone to share this with. There was only one person who would understand. Next door lived Ruth Bennett, her best friend since they were both 19. They'd raised their kids side by side, baked cookies for neighborhood birthdays, and buried their husbands in the same year. Martha slipped the envelope into her sweater pocket and walked the short path between their houses. The wooden gate creaked the same way it had 40 years ago. Ruth opened the door before Martha could even knock. "Well, look who's out of hiding," Ruth teased softly. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Martha smiled faintly. "Close enough," she said, holding out the letter. They sat together at the kitchen table, sunlight falling through lace curtains, painting the room in soft gold. Ruth adjusted her glasses and read the note slowly, her lips moving with each word. When she finished, she reached across the table and took Martha's hand. "He always was the smart one," Ruth said. "Robert knew you'd need this one day." Martha nodded, tears spilling before she could stop them. "He knew me too well. I was ready to just let it all go. Let Grace take whatever she wanted. I thought maybe that was love, giving in." Ruth squeezed her hand tighter. "No, honey. Love isn't giving away your peace. Love is knowing what's worth fighting for." The two women sat quietly for a while. Then Ruth chuckled softly through her tears. "Remember the summer we made cookies for all the neighborhood kids? Burned half of them because we forgot the timer?" Martha laughed, wiping her cheeks. "You blamed the oven. I blamed the weather. Robert just ate the burnt one so the kids wouldn't see." They both laughed until they cried again, not from sadness this time, but from the weight of remembering something good, something whole. The clock ticked. Outside, a few children's voices echoed faintly. The new families that had moved in after the old ones passed or left. The sound wrapped around them like an old song. "Ma, it's a sight. Everything changes, doesn't it?" Ruth leaned back, smiling. "Maybe. But you still make tea too strong. And you still wear that same sweater when you're nervous. So no, not everything." The warmth of that small truth filled the space between them. For the first time in a long time, Martha felt something like peace return. Not the kind that came from comfort, but the kind that comes from clarity. She looked down at the papers again, at Robert's words in fading ink. "Never let anyone take your peace." It wasn't just about property. It was about her spirit, about remembering who she was, the woman who built a life beside a good man, who survived loss, who still knew right from wrong even when love blurred the lines. Martha folded the papers carefully, tucking them back into the envelope. "I think it's time I call someone," she said quietly. Ruth tilted her head. "Who?" Martha looked toward the window where the sea glimmered under the afternoon light. Her voice was calm, steady. "My husband's lawyer. I need to check something about Robert's papers." The next morning, Martha sat across from Mr. Allen, her husband's old attorney. His office smelled like old books and coffee that had been reheated one too many times. He was a kind man, gray hair, round glasses, the kind who'd seen enough family feuds to know when silence spoke louder than shouting. He skimmed through the papers she'd brought, occasionally nodding, the pen in his hand clicking softly. Finally, he looked up and said, "Mrs. Hale, these documents are perfectly valid. The beach house, the land, even the workshop, all under your name. Your daughter had no legal right to sell any of it." Martha didn't answer right away. She just stared out the window, watching two birds fighting over a crumb on the windowsill. "So what happens now?" she asked quietly. "Well," Alan said, straightening his tie, "we can sue the buyers, reverse the transaction and pursue damages. You'll win easily. I'll handle it personally." He said it like he'd done it 1,000 times. Efficient. Professional. The kind of justice that lives on paper. But Martha didn't want paper justice. She leaned back, folding her hands together. "No," she said softly. Alan blinked. "No." Martha shook her head. Let her think she won. He frowned. "Mrs. Hale, that's not wise. You'll lose money, property." "Money isn't what she stole," Martha interrupted. Her voice wasn't angry. It was calm, even gentle. She took something smaller but deeper. Respect. "And if I shout at her now, she'll just cover her ears." "But pain." She paused, meeting his eyes. "Pain teaches where comfort fails." Alan sighed, setting the papers down. "You sound just like your husband. He used to say things like that. Drove me crazy." Martha smiled faintly. Robert always did, like the long way around. For a moment they both sat in silence, the clock ticking softly between them. Then Martha pulled a small leather-bound notebook from her purse, her journal. The pages were soft, creased from years of quiet thoughts no one else would ever read. She opened to a blank page and began to write, her pen scratching lightly. "If I shout, she won't listen. But if I fall silent, maybe her own heart will echo louder." She stared at the words for a while, the ink still wet. It wasn't bitterness she felt. It was something closer to resolve. She'd spent most of her life teaching Grace that love was gentle, forgiving. Maybe now it was time to teach her that love could also be firm and patient. She closed the notebook and looked at Alan. "You'll hold on to everything, right? The deeds, the titles, the documents?" He nodded. "Of course. You want me to start the reversal quietly?" "Yes," she said. Quietly. "No letters, no calls, no warnings. Just make sure the truth stands where it belongs." Alan raised a brow. "And what do you plan to do while I handle the rest?" Martha smiled, the kind of smile that hides a lifetime of understanding. "Life small. Pretend I have nothing. Let her feel what it's like when everything feels certain. And then see how it feels when certainty falls away." Alan exhaled slowly, half in admiration, half in disbelief. "You're not a woman to underestimate, Mrs. Hale." She gave a quiet laugh. "I've had 70 years of practice." He slid a stack of papers toward her. "If we're going to do this your way, I'll need your signature on these. It's an authorization for me to act on your behalf." She picked up the pen. Robert's old fountain pen that she'd carried since the day he passed. The ink flowed easily, dark and clean. Her name looked strong against the page. For a second she traced it with her fingertip, remembering how Robert used to sign his contracts, slow, deliberate, as if every stroke carried weight. When she finished, she placed the pen down carefully. "There," she said softly. "Let's begin." Alan collected the pages, sliding them into a neat folder. "You really don't want her to know what's happening?" "No," Martha said. "Not yet. When the time comes, I want her to see it, not hear it. Words are cheap. The truth should arrive quietly." She stood up, her joints protesting but her back straight. Before leaving, she looked once more at the papers on his desk. So much power, so much history. All hidden behind signatures and seals. But that wasn't where her strength came from. It was in her patience. In her silence. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain from the sea. Martha pulled her coat tighter and began walking home. The streets were nearly empty, save for a couple of teenagers laughing outside a cafe. She smiled faintly as she passed them. It reminded her of Grace at that age, so full of certainty, so sure she knew everything. At home, she made herself tea and opened her journal again. The page she'd written earlier caught the light from the window. She underlined the final words. "Her own heart will echo louder," and whispered to herself, "Let's see if it does." That night, the waves were louder than usual, crashing against the shore like they were trying to tell her she wasn't alone in her silence. She listened for a while, then closed her eyes, whispering one last thing to the dark. "Robert, I'm building again, just the quiet kind of house this time." The mornings came earlier now. Martha found herself waking before the sun, listening to the waves roll in like an old lullaby that refused to fade. The house she'd rented was small, one bedroom, a creaky floor, a chipped sink, but it was enough. For the first time in weeks she could hear herself think. She started walking to the market every morning. The streets were still damp with ocean mist. The smell of salt mixing with the sweetness of bread from the corner bakery. People there didn't know her story. They just saw a quiet older woman with a woven basket and a calm smile. At first a few whispered, "She's the widow who lost her house, poor thing." But Martha didn't correct them. She'd learned that silence can protect more than pride. It can protect peace. At the vegetable stall, Mrs. Lopez, the vendor, always greeted her first. "Good morning, Miss Martha." "Early again?" Martha smiled, running her fingers over the fresh tomatoes. "Early mornings and old habits keep me alive." They laughed together, small and easy. Every morning felt like rebuilding a little piece of normal. The way the sunlight hit the market roofs, the way the fishermen joked about the size of their catch, it all felt real again, not like the hollow echo of an empty house. She'd carry her basket home slowly, stopping to pet the old stray cat that waited near the corner bench. Some days she bought extra bread just to share it with him. It wasn't about kindness. It was about keeping company in silence. People in town began to notice her calmness. Someone once said behind her back, "She's poor, but she's proud." When she heard it, Martha chuckled softly to herself and whispered, "I'm not poor. I'm just quiet." Every morning she made tea the same way Robert used to. 2 spoons of sugar, a slice of lemon, and silence for company. She'd sit by the window, the cup warming her palms, and watch the light change on the horizon. That ritual became her new heartbeat. One afternoon, as she carried her groceries back from the market, she heard a voice from behind. "Mrs. Hale?" It was Harold, her old neighbor from the house near the beach. He looked surprised but genuinely happy to see her. "Well, I'll be damned," he said with a grin. "Haven't seen you in months. How are you holding up?" Martha smiled politely. "One day at a time, Harold. You know how it goes." He nodded. "You're Robert, he was a good man. You know, he fixed our fence 3 times. Wouldn't take a dime." Said, "Good fences keep neighbors honest. The world doesn't make men like him anymore." Martha's lips trembled just a little. She looked at the ground, then back at Harold. "Maybe that's why I'm still here," she said quietly. "To remember them." Harold gave her a soft pat on the shoulder. "Well, if you ever need help, you know where to find me." "I do," she replied, and meant it. When he walked away, Martha stood there for a long moment, the grocery bag heavy in her hand. She realized she wasn't standing in the shadow of what she'd lost anymore. She was standing in the memory of what she'd built, and that was a far stronger foundation. That night, she lit a candle near the window. The flame danced in the reflection of her teacup, and she thought about Robert, about how he used to hum when fixing something, about how his hands always smelled like cedar, about how, even after death, he had found a way to protect her. The phone rang, cutting through the quiet. It startled her. The only people who called anymore were wrong numbers or telemarketers. She picked up, half expecting silence. "Mrs. Hale?" It was Mr. Allen. His tone carried a hint of satisfaction. "I wanted to inform you. The property transfer is complete. The beach house, the land. Everything is officially back under your control." Martha didn't speak right away. She just looked out the window toward the dark horizon where the sea met the night sky. For a second she swore she could see the outline of the old house in her mind, its porch lights glowing, Robert sitting on the steps waiting for her. Finally she exhaled. "Thank you, Mr. Allen." He paused. "Would you like to make it public? I can notify your daughter if you wish." "No," Martha said gently. "Not yet. Some lessons are better learned when no one knows they're being taught." When the call ended, she set the phone down and returned to her chair. The tea had gone cold, but she didn't mind. She raised the cup slightly toward the empty chair across from her and whispered, "You'd be proud of me, Robert." I didn't shout. I just built quietly. Outside, the town lights flickered on one by one, like old memories lighting up the night. Martha smiled. A small, peaceful smile that carried both sadness and strength. Tomorrow she'd go back to the market. She'd buy bread, pet the cat, and listen to the fishermen laugh. Life was still going on, and she was still part of it. Rain came down in sheets over the narrow streets of Paris, turning everything, every sound, every light, into a blur. Grace stood under the awning of what used to be her favorite cafe, clutching a folder of papers her husband had left on the table that morning. The ink on the signatures was still fresh. Her hands were shaking. She had signed them without reading, trusting the man she thought she knew. "It's just for a small investment," he'd said, smiling the way he always did when he wanted something. Now, standing in the drizzle, she stared at the bank's notice again. It wasn't an investment. It was a loan. Huge one. And it was all in her name. By the end of the week, their apartment was gone. The car, the savings, even her name felt like it had been pawned off. Her husband vanished, No note, no call. Just gone. Grace tried to hold herself together. She told the bank manager it was a mistake. She told her friends it was temporary. But when she looked in the mirror that night, she didn't see the confident woman who'd once told her mother she didn't need anyone. She saw someone small. Someone scared. When the last of her money ran out, she sold her watch, then her coat. Finally, she booked the cheapest flight back to the States, 1 connection, 3 layovers. But when she reached the airport, her card declined. The clerk's voice was polite, practiced. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Your account's frozen." So she sat down near the terminal window, her suitcase under her legs, her head against the cold glass. Outside, the rain kept falling. Travelers hurried past, their voices blending into the sound of rolling luggage and overhead announcements. That night she didn't sleep much. She watched an old woman in a heavy coat collecting aluminum cans from the trash bins. The woman's movements were slow but steady, her eyes focused, proud even in the act of bending down. Grace couldn't look away. For a second it wasn't the old woman she saw. It was her mother, Martha, standing in the yard years ago, hanging laundry in the cold, refusing to come inside until everything was done. Grace used to roll her eyes back then, complaining that her mom was too old-fashioned. But now, sitting on a plastic airport chair with nothing left, Grace realized what she'd missed. Her mother's quiet dignity wasn't weakness. It was strength. The loudspeaker called for another flight, but Grace didn't move. Her reflection in the glass looked older than she remembered. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and whispered to no one, "Mom, I'm sorry." When morning came, she used the airport's Wi-Fi to check her email. There it was. The new message from a U.S. law firm she didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Notice of foreclosure. Property under Martha Hale Enterprises." She opened it, her stomach twisting. The house, the beach house she thought she'd sold, her mother's home, wasn't hers to sell at all. It had been under Martha's company name the entire time. "No," she whispered. "No, that can't be right." Her chest tightened. She tried calling the number listed in the email, but her phone died mid-dial. All she could see on the black screen was her own reflection. Wet hair, hollow eyes, the look of someone who had finally hit the bottom she thought she'd never reach. She found a payphone, the kind she hadn't used since she was a teenager. Her fingers fumbled as she put in the coins. It rang once, twice, then a voice, warm but tired. "Hello?" Grace closed her eyes, tears spilling. "It's me. I don't know what to do. I've lost everything." There was a pause. Just the faint sound of the ocean on the other end. Then Martha's voice, soft, steady, the same as always. "Come home, Grace." The door was never locked. For the first time in years, Grace broke down completely. The kind of crying that shakes your whole body. Not just for what she'd lost, but for how long she'd stayed blind to what really mattered. She hung up slowly, clutching the receiver like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Then she picked up her suitcase, its wheels squeaking from the rain, and made her way toward the boarding gate. Hours later, on the long flight home, the world outside was dark. The plane hummed softly as she stared out the window. Below her, cities flickered like tiny stars. She thought of her mother drinking tea by the window, the smell of cedar and salt air filling the room. She thought of the house she'd taken for granted, and the hands that built it. By the time the plane landed, dawn had begun to break over the coastline. The air was cool, heavy with fog. Grace stepped out, dragging her suitcase through the puddles outside the terminal. She didn't have money for a taxi, so she walked, mile after mile, until the streets grew familiar. When she finally reached it, she stopped. The old wooden gate, the mailbox that still leaned slightly to one side. Her breath hitched. The house stood exactly as she remembered. Sturdy, quiet, unbothered by time. Light spilled faintly from one window, warm against the gray morning. Grace set her suitcase down and covered her mouth as the tears came again. Louder this time, heavier, real. She walked to the porch, her knees weak, her heart hammering. Then, through her sobs, she whispered to the door. "I'm home, Mom." The door creaked open just like it used to, and Grace froze in the doorway, suitcase in hand. The house smelled the same salt, cedar, the hint of her mother's lavender soap. It felt smaller than she remembered, or maybe she had just gotten used to places that were bigger and emptier. Her mother was in the kitchen, pouring hot water into the old teapot. She didn't turn around, didn't rush to hug her or scold her. Just said quietly, "You look tired, dear." Grace's throat tightened. That one sentence hit harder than any lecture could. "I am," she whispered, closing the door behind her. The sound of the latch catching made her shiver. Martha set 2 cups on the table, steam rising between them like a thin veil. "Sit. You must be hungry." Dinner was simple, soup and bread, the way it always had been. The clock ticked in the background, the ocean hummed beyond the windows, and silence filled everything else. It wasn't an angry silence. It was heavy, almost sacred. Grace couldn't eat much. She stirred her soup and said softly, "He's gone. He took everything." Martha nodded, eyes steady on her daughter's face. "I know." Grace blinked. "You know? Mr. Allen told me," Martha said. "But I didn't call you. You needed to find your way back on your own." Grace looked down, ashamed. "I thought I had it all figured out. So, I didn't need this place. Didn't need you." Martha smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from both love and old wounds. That's what growing up is for, finding out what we really need after we lose it. The air between them felt fragile but warm. Grace's voice trembled. "Mom, I was so stupid." "No," Martha said softly, setting her spoon down. "You were just young. So was I once." For a while they ate in silence again. The sound of the clock and the faint rustle of wind against the shutters filled the room. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't cruel either. It was the kind of quiet that says, "We're still here." After dinner, Martha started cleaning up while Grace wandered through the living room. The same photos lined the walls, her father laughing in the garden, the three of them at the beach, her own high school graduation photo still slightly tilted in its frame. Grace ran her fingers along the edge of the piano, the one her father used to play on stormy nights. For the first time she realized how much this house had held for her, even after she turned her back on it. When the dishes were done, Martha sat down on the old sofa, the thin blanket across her legs. The lamplight softened her features, and Grace saw the years that had quietly built up in her mother's face. "Do you ever miss him?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Martha's eyes softened, distant. "Every day. He told me once, love doesn't protect you from pain. It gives pain a purpose." Grace swallowed hard. "What purpose did mine have?" Martha looked at her for a long moment, then reached out and took her hand. "To remind you that love isn't a transaction. It's work. It's faith. And sometimes it's silence." Grace's eyes filled with tears. She wanted to say something, an apology maybe, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. For the first time in years she didn't feel the need to talk. The warmth was enough. When Martha finally drifted off to sleep on the sofa, Grace covered her with the blanket and turned off the lamp. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock and the sound of waves rolling in from the shore. Grace sat at the small writing desk near the window, the one her father used to keep his tools in. She opened the top drawer, looking for a pen to write a note, something to thank her mother in the morning. But instead, her fingers brushed against a sealed envelope tucked beneath a stack of old papers. It was yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded. Her heart skipped when she saw the handwriting. She'd know it anywhere. "For when our daughter forgets who she is." Her breath caught. She sat perfectly still for a moment, the envelope trembling in her hand. Her father had been gone for over a decade. Yet here he was, reaching out from the past like he'd been waiting for this very moment. Grace turned toward her sleeping mother, the shadows soft across her face, the faint sound of her breathing steady and peaceful. Tears welled up as she whispered to the quiet room, "I think I forgot, Dad. But I'm ready to remember." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain and sea through the open window. The world felt heavy but not hopeless. She held the envelope close to her chest, her hand shaking with something new. Not fear, not shame. Hope. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, like it carried the weight of years, not paper. Grace sat at her father's old desk, the lamplight warm against her trembling hands. She traced the edges before finally breaking the seal. Inside was a single brass key and a note written in the handwriting she hadn't seen since the funeral. Her father's letters were neat but slightly slanted, like he'd written them slowly, carefully, knowing one day someone broken might need to read them. If she ever comes back home broken, the note said, help her rebuild, not with money but with patience. Grace's breath caught in her throat. The paper slipped from her fingers and floated to the desk. Her hands covered her mouth as the tears came fast, almost choking her. Mom, he planned for this? She whispered through sobs. Martha nodded, her eyes glistening in the dim light. He planned for love to be the teacher. That's how your father saw life. Every mistake, every loss. Just another lesson wrapped in pain. Grace shook her head, wiping at her cheeks. I thought he left me nothing. I thought I disappointed him. Martha leaned closer, her voice soft but firm. He never left you with nothing, Grace. He left you with everything that lasts. The next morning, they went to the small community bank downtown, the same one where Robert Hale had opened an account 40 years ago. The clerk, a man with kind eyes, recognized the last name right away. Your father used to bring coffee for everyone when he came in, he said with a nostalgic smile. Said it made the paperwork go faster. Grace smiled through her tears. That sounds like him. He guided them to a small private room. The safe deposit box was old and slightly rusted around the handle, Grace turned the key and felt it click open. The sound so soft yet so final it made her heart stutter. Inside were only a few items: the pocket watch, her father's wedding band, the photograph of her as a child sitting on his shoulders, and a small savings book, the balance modest, almost symbolic. Grace picked up the pocket watch first. It was still ticking. She pressed it to her ear, and for a moment, it was like she could hear his heartbeat again. Then she lifted the ring, the gold dulled with age, but the engraving inside still clear. R+M 1972. She turned it in her hand, the metal catching the light. He never stopped believing in people, she murmured. Even me. Martha touched her daughter's shoulder. He believed you'd find your way, even if it meant falling first. Grace took a deep breath. Mom, I can sell this. The ring, the watch. It might help pay back some of the debt. Martha looked at her for a long moment. The light through the window fell across her face, soft but steady. If that's what you need to do, then do it, she said. Sometimes we must lose the symbol to learn the meaning. Grace hesitated, her hand tightening around the ring. And if it hurts? It should, Martha said gently. That's how you'll know it's real. Outside, the sun had already begun to set, washing the town in gold. Grace stepped out of the bank, the envelope tucked under her arm, the ring in her palm. The metal was warm from her touch, but it felt like fire. A reminder of what she'd broken, and what she could still mend. She walked slowly down Main Street, the same street where her father used to buy her ice cream when she was little. Every storefront felt like a ghost from another life. When she passed the old jewelry shop on the corner, she stopped. Through the window, she saw a man polishing a watch under a yellow lamp. The soft hum of an old jazz record drifted out through the open door. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed. The gentle, melancholy sound. The jeweler looked up, smiled politely. Evening, miss. How can I help you? Grace opened her hand, the ring resting in her palm like a confession. I need to sell this. He nodded, recognizing the kind of sadness that doesn't need explaining. It's a beautiful piece, he said quietly. Belonged to someone important? Grace's eyes glistened. Yes, she said softly. The best man I've ever known. He examined the ring, then met her gaze. Some things money can't measure, he said gently. Grace smiled faintly. I know. As he turned to weigh the ring, the golden light from the lamp caught the tears that had been waiting in her eyes. They fell silently, tracing the lines of her face as she whispered to herself, "This isn't goodbye, Dad. It's just me learning what you meant." When she walked back out into the fading sunlight, the world looked different. The same streets, the same sky, but she felt lighter, emptier in a way that made room for something new. In her pocket, the pocket watch ticked on, steady as ever. And somewhere between the sound of it and the glow of the sunset, Grace realized, maybe redemption doesn't come when you get everything back. Maybe it comes when you finally understand what you were given all along. The mornings came earlier now. Grace woke before the alarm most days, her body still wired to the quiet discipline of survival. The first job started at 6. The small coffee shop downtown, the kind that smelled like burnt toast and dreams that never quite took off. She worked the register, then the counter, wiping tables when things slowed down. No one there knew who she used to be, the woman who wore designer shoes, ordered lattes instead of making them, and she liked it that way. Every cup she poured, every crumb she swept, felt like something being rebuilt, one humble motion at a time. In the evenings, she walked across town to the old high school where the janitor had taken her on as extra help. The halls smelled the same: chalk, floor wax, and memory. Her name was still carved into one of the desks in room 214. She remembered sitting there, telling her best friend she'd leave this small town behind forever. Now she was back, pushing a mop across those same floors. It was quiet work, but not lonely. The sound of students' laughter carried through the halls, bouncing off the lockers, echoing like something alive. Every time she heard it, something in her chest softened. That sound, it wasn't noise anymore. It was proof that life goes on, even when yours falls apart. One evening, as she knelt to scrub a scuff mark near the stairwell, she heard a voice behind her. "Grace, is that really you?" She turned and saw a familiar face, Mrs. Parker, her old literature teacher. The woman was older now, her hair fully gray, her posture still perfect. She looked at Grace with a kind of disbelief that hurt more than judgment ever could. "You were the girl who used to dream big," Mrs. Parker said gently. "What happened?" Grace sat back on her heels, breathing out a quiet laugh. "I thought success meant distance," she said. "Turns out it means return." Mrs. Parker smiled, eyes softening. "Then maybe you found more than you lost." After she left, Grace stood in the empty hallway, the mop handle cool in her hands. The light from the overhead fixtures reflected off the freshly cleaned floors, and she could see her own face faintly mirrored there, tired, older, but peaceful in a way she hadn't known before. She finished her shift, locked up, and walked out into the night. The street lamps flickered as she passed, and she felt something strange, gratitude maybe, for the chance to work, to start over, to be small again. The next day she came early. The sun hadn't even touched the windows yet. She put on her gloves, filled the bucket, and began to mop near the entrance. The sound of students trickling in, shoes squeaking, laughter bursting suddenly, filled the hallway. For a moment she stopped and listened. It was the same sound she'd once taken for granted, the same joy she'd once thought was behind her. Now it felt like a gift. Her eyes stung, but not from sadness. It was something else, the quiet, steady understanding that this right here was the ground where humility met peace. Later that afternoon, she sat outside on the school steps, sipping leftover coffee from the cafe. The janitor passed by, tipping his cap. "You're one of the good ones," he said simply, and she smiled. Maybe that's all she ever needed to hear. Across the street, the car had been parked for a while. Inside, Martha sat in the passenger seat beside Mr. Allen, watching her daughter through the windshield. Grace didn't see them. She was too busy sweeping leaves from the steps, humming softly under her breath. Mr. Allen cleared his throat. "She's been consistent," he said. "We can clear her debts this week, Mrs. Hale. It's all ready." Martha didn't answer right away. She kept her eyes on her daughter, her hands folded over her purse. The sight of Grace in that janitor's uniform, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, face calm, filled her with both pride and ache. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but certain. "Not yet, Allen. Don't clear her debts yet." The lawyer looked at her, surprised. "But she's not done," Martha said softly. "She's still finding herself. Let her finish her journey." They sat in silence for a moment, watching as Grace picked up her mop and disappeared back into the building. Martha looked out toward the setting sun, her reflection faint in the glass. "Robert used to say every floor tells a story," she whispered. "I think she's learning to read hers." Inside, the lights flicked on again. The mop glided across the hallway, slow and sure, and with each stroke Grace's reflection grew clearer on the polished floor. She wasn't cleaning anymore. She was rebuilding. One tile, one breath, one lesson at a time. The morning light poured through the tall windows of Alan's office, the kind of golden light that made even the dust look sacred. Grace sat stiffly in the leather chair across from his desk, her fingers tangled together, eyes darting between her mother and the lawyer. Martha, as usual, looked calm, the kind of calm that came from surviving storms before. Alan cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "Mrs. Hale, Miss Hale, thank you for coming. I know it's been a long road, but I think it's time we put everything on the table." Grace frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Alan opened a folder, thick with papers that looked far too familiar. The beach house, the land, the small company. All these properties were never sold. They were never even legally transferred. They were under Mrs. Hale's ownership the entire time. For a second no one spoke. Grace blinked, trying to process what she'd heard. I don't understand." Alan slid a document toward her. Her own signature stared back at her from the sale papers, stamped and sealed, and completely invalid. "Your mother never signed the co-authorization," he said quietly. "Which means none of the transactions were binding. Everything you thought you lost was never gone." Grace's lips parted, but no words came out. Her chest felt tight, her ears ringing. Finally she looked at her mother, voice trembling. "Mom, you let me drown." Martha's eyes softened, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "No," she said gently. "I let the tide teach you how to swim. That was it, the dam broke." Grace's breath hitched, her tears falling faster than she could stop them. All the anger, the shame, the exhaustion. It all melted into something deeper. Relief. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "For everything. For not listening. For thinking you were weak. For forgetting who raised me." Martha stood slowly, her joints creaking, but her presence was steady as she reached across and pulled Grace into her arms. "You were never lost," she whispered. "Just learning your way home." Grace buried her face into her mother's shoulder, her tears soaking the soft fabric of her sweater. Martha didn't flinch. She just held her, one hand resting on the back of her daughter's head like she used to when Grace was little. The room fell quiet. The only sound was the soft ticking of the wall clock and the low hum of the world outside. When they finally pulled apart, Grace wiped her face, laughing through the tears. "Dad would have loved to see this," she said. Martha turned toward the wall behind Alan's desk, where a framed photo of Robert Hale hung, taken years ago, back when his smile still carried the weight of building a family from nothing. The sunlight from the window caught the glass, scattering across the frame in golden flecks. "He is seeing it," Martha said softly. "Every time we choose love over pride, he's right here." Alan cleared his throat again, though his own eyes looked suspiciously shiny. Well, Mrs. Hale, shall I process the restoration documents? Martha nodded. Yes, but take your time, Alan. We're not in a rush anymore. Grace turned to her mother. How did you even plan all this? Why didn't you just tell me? Martha smiled knowingly. Because some lessons can't be told, Grace. They have to be lived. If I'd stopped you, you'd only remember the warning, not the wisdom. Grace laughed softly, shaking her head. You're something else, Mom. I learned from the best, Martha replied, glancing again at Robert's photo. For a moment, the light in the room seemed to shift, warmer somehow. Like forgiveness itself had opened the window. They sat there together side by side, as Alan quietly gathered the paperwork. Neither of them spoke because there wasn't anything left to say. Everything that needed to be understood was already there. In the silence, in the touch, in the shared air of peace that replaced years of distance. As they got up to leave, Martha turned to her daughter, her voice soft but steady. Grace, she said. Yep, if you have a daughter one day. Martha paused, smiling gently. Don't protect her from storms. Teach her to build roofs. Grace swallowed hard, blinking back tears again. I will, she whispered. Outside, the day was brighter than before. The air smelled like rain that had finally passed. Grace reached for her mother's hand. Not out of weakness, but out of understanding. Martha squeezed it back, their fingers fitting together easily, naturally, like two pieces of something that had always belonged side by side. They walked out of the office into the afternoon sun, the city humming softly around them. No noyes. No money. No tensión. Just the sound of footsteps, steady in sync, and the quiet truth that love, when it's real, never runs out. 6 months passed, and the air by the coast had that familiar smell again, salt, pine, and a little bit of sawdust. The old house by the beach was alive now, not in the way of luxury or noise, but in the quiet rhythm of laughter and small beginnings. Grace stood in the front yard surrounded by a handful of children, orphans, teenagers who'd aged out of the system, kids who had nowhere else to go. She was showing them how to balance a small notebook of expenses, her voice patient and steady. Money isn't power, she told them, smiling. It's just a mirror. It shows you who you are when you have it, and who you are when you don't. One of the younger boys, maybe 13, raised his hand shyly. But what if you mess up? Grace laughed softly. Then you start again. That's the beauty of it, you always get to rebuild. Behind them the sea whispered its endless song, and from the porch Martha watched quietly, the mug of tea cradled in her hands. There was pride in her eyes, the kind that doesn't come from achievement but from recognition. Her daughter was home and she was finally whole. Inside, the house looked different now. The walls had been repainted a soft cream, the windows polished until they caught every glint of light. In the middle of the living room stood the same wooden table Robert had built decades ago. The one that had survived every fight, every dinner, every tear. The surface was newly polished, smooth again after years of neglect. Grace had spent an entire afternoon sanding it down, oiling it, running her fingers over every scar it carried. You see this mark? She said once, tracing a small dent with her thumb. That's from when Dad dropped his hammer. He said not to fix it, that imperfections remind us we're still human. Now the table was a symbol again of work, of healing, of what can shine when you stop trying to hide the cracks. That afternoon, Grace and Martha stood side by side, hanging the new wooden sign above the front door. The letters carved into it read, Poem of Second Chances. Grace stepped back, eyes shining. The house didn't change, she said softly. We did. Martha smiled. Maybe that's what it was waiting for. They painted together for the rest of the day, Grace humming quietly while Martha touched up the trim with careful strokes. When evening came, they sat on the porch with the kids, passing around bowls of soup and laughing at stories from the old neighborhood. One of the boys asked, So, this was your house before? Grace nodded. Still is. But now it's yours too, at least for a while. The boy looked puzzled. Why'd you give it up? Grace thought for a moment, then looked at her mother. Because sometimes you have to lose a home to understand what makes one. The porch fell quiet for a second, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, the kind that feels full. The sound of the waves came up through the dark, steady and patient. Later, when the kids had gone to bed, Martha walked through the house slowly. The light from the kitchen spilled onto the floor, pitting the old family photo still hanging near the stairs. Robert, smiling with sawdust on his shirt, one arm around her shoulders, the other holding a small gap-toothed Grace. She reached out, brushing the frame gently, her fingers trembling just a bit. Then she turned toward the small camera set up on the dining table. Grace had been filming small clips for their foundation's website. Testimonials, lessons, moments. Martha pressed the record button, took a deep breath and looked straight into the lens. If you still have a parent to call, she said softly, call them today. Don't wait for the lesson to hurt. Don't wait for silence to answer the things you never said. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. Instead, she smiled, the kind of smile that comes when the wound finally becomes part of the story instead of the pain. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the windows, catching on the polished wood of the table. Grace was making breakfast while the kids set the table. Someone turned on the old radio, and a familiar tune drifted through the air, something Robert used to whistle when he worked in the yard. Martha closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound carry her back. But this time it didn't hurt. Felt like presence, not loss. When she opened her eyes, Grace was looking at her from across the kitchen, smiling that same smile Robert used to wear. Patient, grounded, hopeful. Martha raised her cup of tea slightly like a toast. Grace nodded, understanding without a word. The day went on, kids running on the sand, laughter echoing off the porch, the smell of bread and sea salt mixing in the breeze. And from somewhere deep in the walls of that old house, the one that had held love, anger, grief and forgiveness, it felt as if the past had finally exhaled. The camera from the night before was still sitting on the table, the red light blinking softly. It caught one last shot. Grace standing in the doorway, sunlight behind her, her mother's hand resting gently on her arm. Martha's voice lingered in the background, quiet but clear. Tag someone who forgot the value of home. Because one day silence will answer when no one else can.